Algebra Chapter 2, and we're going to combine Lessons 1 and 2 in this series of videos as we move through these two lessons. So we'll begin by looking at the sets of numbers, the different sets of numbers. How do we put those numbers on the number line? How do they get in order? And then once we have this number line, how we can use that to help us compare numbers. And then finally, we'll take a look at absolute value. So with sets of numbers, let's take a look at these different sets that we have. And sets of numbers are really simply a way to classify numbers so we can easily identify them. When we talk about classifying, really classifying is simply it's like taking a box of Legos and saying, I want to organize these so when I'm looking for a specific piece, I can find it quickly. So maybe the first thing I do with a box of Legos is to divide it into different colors. So I have a red, yellow, black, white box, and so I have all these different boxes. So I start with a very big box of everything, and then I get more specific by classifying them by color. And then maybe I want to classify them by the different heights. You know, you have the flat ones, and then you have the ones that are like 2 high, and then you have maybe some that are 3 high. So then maybe you take the red colors and you have 3 boxes, one with the 1 high, 2 high, and 3 high, and you do that with all those. And then maybe you classify them, then you go even further and start separating by how many tabs, those little tabs they have on them. So that when you finally get done, you have all these very small boxes of very specific types of Legos, so that when you want to find a, height 1 tab red Lego, you just go right over here and you can grab it. And so classifying is a way of doing that. But keep in mind, we start with this big box and we get more and more specific as we go down. So we're going to do the same thing with numbers. We start with the big box of all numbers. That's the real numbers. That's the large orange box you see on the screen here. And so the big number we're going to have in here, we have all the types of numbers that you could possibly think of. These are what we call the real numbers. And we call them real because there are imaginary numbers, which we're not going to deal with till much later this year, if at all. But we have this real numbers. So out of this real number box, we want to separate these into more specific categories so we know what we're working with. So out of the big box, we separate it into 2 types of numbers, what we call rational numbers and what we call irrational numbers. And so this is a smaller rectangle divided into 2 pieces. Over here on the left, you have the rational box, and over here you have the irrational box. All right? Now, what's the difference? When we're looking at the real numbers, how do we know whether to put the number in the rational box or the irrational box? Well, the rational numbers are numbers where they can be written as fractions with using integers. And we'll talk about integers in a minute. So maybe that's not so helpful. But maybe think of it this way. If you take a fraction, 1/2, and you divide it out, either on your calculator or do long division, the decimal equivalent of that number will end 0.5. Okay, so the decimal ends. Or if you take the fraction 1/3 and divide it out, you're going to get 0.33333. It repeats, that 3 repeats over and over. If the number ends or repeats, it's a rational number. So any number that has a decimal that ends or repeats is a rational number. Any number whose decimal doesn't end or repeat is what we call irrational. And we're not going to spend a lot of time, but the number pi or the square root of a non-perfect square. Now, the irrational numbers, that's as specific as we can get with those. There are no other classifications for that box. But the rational numbers, we can break it down into 3 other even more specific types of categories. The next most specific category, notice this oval, but it's inside the rational number box, which is inside the real number box, is an integer. And the integer, basically what we do is out of the rational numbers, we take all the numbers that are positive and negative and the number 0, and we leave the fractions behind. So anything that's a fraction, anything that has a decimal number to it, is an integer. So we're looking at all the positive numbers and their opposites, which are the negatives, along with the number 0. Then inside that, or even more specific than that, we can get even a smaller box. Out of the integers, out of all those positive, negative numbers, if we just took the positive numbers along with 0 with us, then this is going to be the whole number box. So even more specific. Still a real number, still a rational number, still an integer, but it's a very specific type of integer. Then there's one more oval that we could put inside here that's not shown here, but that is what we call the natural numbers. And the natural numbers are from the whole numbers, which are just positive and 0. We take all the positive numbers, but we don't include 0. And we call those the natural numbers. Those are the ones we naturally use as we begin counting. So these are the different sets of numbers. We need to be able to classify these. Again, real numbers being the very general term, that's everything. Natural number being the most specific term. So to classify it, what you'll need to do is start with real numbers, then start asking the question. Well, does this decimal repeat? If it does, it's a rational. And then go, okay, is it positive or negative but not a fraction? Yes, it's an integer. Okay, is it a positive number or 0? Yes, so it's a whole number. All right, so these are the different sets of numbers. We want to be able to identify those. Keep this little chart in mind. Maybe reproduce that in your notes, so when you go to classifying numbers, you'll have a nice reference sheet.